I can't help but feel that while you nevertheless practice in equity and commercial law, your talents could have been just as well put to use in the more human areas, if you like, of family law, criminal law?
Well, I didn't like family law or criminal law for a rather venal reason. I would never felt easy taking fees from people who couldn't afford to pay. Criminal field, there's not much money there. Family law, I'd look at the accounts and you'd see that the people are scratching along on low remuneration, and I wasn't easy in my own mind taking money. I had some big clients. Warwick Fairfax, the head of was a client. I had no problem in charging him fees, but lesser mortals, I didn't like taking money for doing things, and I suppose I was too venal to do it for nothing. You know, well, with 4 young children, but it was as much as anything, the financial aspect. Big commercial entity, banks, shipping companies. I went to the First River Council, was a bank. Went over for the next time was a shipping company, P&O, and that, no problem at all there. But the thought that I was, being paid money that they couldn't afford to pay me was always and it's remained with me very much as an awareness that successful lawyers do tend to over-remunerate themselves.
And perhaps too, the areas of equity law and commercial law were the better for the fact that you did indeed have that solid grounding in human nature. Perhaps that's where maybe other fellow practitioners were a little lacking?
I think that's it, yes. I think my sensitivity to human nature is really pervaded by a career at the bar, I suppose, and you could say in the Navy. Yeah, I decided after my first sea trip in the Navy of seasickness that the lower deck was not for me, swinging in a hammock. You know, we had hammocks in those days. Hammocks are very comfortable, but hammocks are slung down in a hole. It was a sugar ship. We were all being seasick. Most of us had a bucket hanging on the hammock lanyard to be sick into and lurching around. I decided this wasn't for me. And so I decided I was going to get I looked up there were the officers up there with a reasonable degree of civilization, and I thought, I'm going to get a commission. And I got 100% in the officer's examination. First time anybody had ever done it in the Navy, apparently. But that sort of marked me out a bit amongst my others. And I thought I got 100% in the... But I learnt, the rough side of things, but from seeing and undergoing a little bit of that hardship, thinking this isn't for me. And so that influence was there. I wanted to be to the forefront.
During these years, I must ask you a little bit more about the activities of your mother, Jessie Street, because she continued to be very active and, in fact, got herself into quite a bit of trouble, I know, being perceived as a communist and a communist sympathiser, certainly during the late 1940s into the early 50s. But she was also very involved in Aboriginal rights, and in recent weeks we've had the 20th anniversary of the Mabo decision. Had she lived, would you imagine she would have been pretty happy to see how things have panned out since her days of involvement in Aboriginal rights? Because she certainly had a lot to do with the very important referendum that gave Aborigines voting rights in the late 60s.
She was brought up in the Clarence River on a cattle property, and it was a grant that her grandfather had been given, and her mother inherited it, and not far from the castle, where he built a Moorish castle up there.
On the Clarendon River in northern New South Wales.
The Clarence, yeah. And so not far from the castle was what they call the Black Scab, Aboriginal stockmen, and her playmates were the Aboriginal children. And they taught her to swim at the river and to fish, and she used to go out with that. She had no idea of discrimination. Her father was a very broad-minded man, and she mixed free with him as her friends and playmates, and that gave her sense of equality of humanity, and she passed that on down to us.
Was she very much in your life during those years? Was she in any way a strong background influence, or was she very busy with her own work and her own affairs?
Both. But as an arrogant young male, I was not susceptible of a great deal of influence from my mother.
You weren't embarrassed by her at any stage? Given her outspokenness and her refusal to ever back away from her communist beliefs, for example?
No, not really. No. I won't say I was as proud of it as I would be these days, but it was not embarrassment. It was just one of Mum's, enthusiasms that she was pursuing.
Is it true she could crack a stock whip with both hands?
Stock whip. I used to breed horses, which is the origin of my current debilitated physical state, really. But she'd come up. I bought a property up in Canyon Lee, outside of Mossvale. She would come up sometimes and she would crack a stock whip, much to the astonishment of the boys. But she could crack a whip in both hands.
She certainly was a remarkable person. Do you sometimes, I'm digressing here, but do you sometimes think they should make a film about her life?
Yeah, it was a fascinating life, widely faceted, from her days as a small girl in India, when coming out in a ship, and the early chapters of a biography that she wrote, a very moving sort of picture of her life as a child, and then her father, decided that this wasn't very suitable for Jessie to be growing up as a colonial girl. She went then to a ladies' boarding school in England, Wickham Abbey, and there was a wonderful headmistress there who she idolised, who brought her out very much and gave her independence and a sense of purpose in life.
It's interesting and very touching how important headmasters, headmistresses in those days were for people, certainly for you and certainly for your mother. They played as much, if not more, of a role than your own parents in a way, didn't they?
I think that's very perceptive. It's never occurred to me in that sort of comparative sense, but it's right. I was more influenced by my headmasters than by my father and mother. It hadn't occurred to me before, but I think that would be so.